What would you do if you stumbled upon a story that was never meant to leave the archives, an event so grotesque, so profoundly unsettling, that even governments moved to erase it from history? Tonight, you and I will walk into the shadows together. But be warned, once you hear this story, you cannot unhear it. It will mark you. It will live in your blood. It will change the way you look at families, at power, at the ocean itself. The year was 1933, and a postal worker approached the iron gates of a grand colonial estate on the isolated island of Ilhaus Corvos. He thought he was delivering a letter. Instead, he opened the door to one of the darkest chapters in Portuguese history, one that authorities buried for nearly a century. When he stepped inside that mansion, silence pressed against him like a physical weight. The walls seemed alive, as though they had absorbed screams, chants, and things no language could hold. The house was set as if for a feast, 8 plates, though only 6 members lived there. A book, bound in something that was not leather, stood open on a pedestal, and from the back entrance, a trail of footprints led out toward the sea, elongated, unnatural, marked with too many toes. This is the story of the Caetano family. A dynasty of wealth, secrecy, and corruption, a family that engaged in forbidden rituals that shattered the boundary between human and inhuman, and whose fate remains cloaked in mystery even now. Their obsession was not merely with wealth, nor power in politics, nor the pleasures of the flesh. Their obsession was older, something buried beneath the waves, older than Christianity, older than Portugal, older than civilization itself. Why does this story matter to you? Because the Caetano case is not just about one family lost to madness, it is about systems of silence. It is about how institutions, governments, churches, universities move in unison when the truth threatens to tear the mask off our collective illusions. It is about the way power uses secrets as weapons, the way it shapes human behavior like clay, and the way men like you are kept in the dark, fed illusions while the real story unfolds behind locked doors. And that is why you must listen with full attention, because this tale is not entertainment, it is an initiation. By the time you reach the end, you will see how deep the corruption goes, not only on a forgotten Portuguese island, but in every institution you still trust today. So I ask you directly, before we descend further, where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state in the comments, because you are about to join a brotherhood of men scattered across the world who have heard the truth and refuse to look away. But understand this, from here, every step pulls you deeper into the forbidden. The Caetanos did not vanish. They transformed. The records prove it. And if you stay with me, if you commit to hearing the entire truth, you may begin to see the same patterns around you, in your government, in your family, even in yourself. Tonight, the ocean will speak, and you will listen. There are no casual details here, only pieces of a pattern the powerful have spent decades erasing. The Caetanos arrived on Ilhaus Corvos wrapped in scandal, carrying a name that smelled of salt and money and something fouler they would not speak of. They bought land like kings, built a fortress like priests, and taught themselves to move through the island like a ghost court. But wealth alone does not explain what they became. Power needs an engine, a belief, a covenant, an object, a technique. For the Caetanos, that engine was intimacy turned into ritual, and ritual turned into transmutation. They taught themselves to treat family as a laboratory, and the human body as an instrument to bend toward other laws. Imagine a family that writes its own anatomy into its ledger, who chart births as experiments, who annotate faces with symbols, who mark children's limbs with ink that reads like a litany. That's how the journals describe it, not with the horror of an outsider, but with the cold, proud language of men convinced they are engineers of fate. Their patriarch, Mateus Caetano, did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as an architect of emergence, a man rebuilding his blood to fit an older covenant. He wrote of the pact as if it were a contract with the sea itself, an old promise made long ago by an ancestor on another shore. The sea in the Caetano theology was not a body of water. It was a repository of memory and contracts, a living ledger that could be bargained with through salt and ritual and intimate offerings. You must understand the psychological scaffolding that made this possible. The island was small. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone feared the Caetanos. The family cultivated isolation with precision, selective generosity, silent disdain for local customs, and a performance of refinement that masked ritual. Their servants were paid well and then torgone to keep their mouths closed with a mixture of bribery and insinuation. The village absorbed this dynamic like a chronic illness, resentment at the surface, but buried compliance beneath. Power learns to work with social shame. It doesn't shout its crimes. It arranges the world so people look away. But why the body? Why eroticize transformation? Because control fashions itself most efficiently when it can rewire desire. When forbidden practices are framed as sacred, they gain an irresistibility that logic cannot touch. The Caetanos turned private acts into ceremonial thresholds. The rituals blurred the line between consent and coercion, between devotion and domination. They crafted an ideology where love, lineage, and sacrifice overlapped, where obedience to the family meant obeying the sea. The younger members, raised inside that doctrine, internalized the rules until they could no longer tell which impulses were theirs and which were prescribed. That is the most dangerous alchemy, turning a human being into both priest and offering. Listen to this detail: small, domestic, corrosive. The family table. 8 place settings for 6 people. An excess that reads like a vow. An invitation left open to some other presence. That empty place at the table is a ritual hinge. It suggests they were preparing not only for kin, but for an arrival, something they expected to join them, to consume and be consumed. When men bind themselves to a mythic guest at the table, their loyalties shift. They are no longer accountable solely to law or blood, but to the guest's desires. That guest can be an idea, an idol, a creature from the deep. It becomes the center of a private polity. The island records, the secret notes discovered later by Dr. Carvalho, reveal a patient, methodical plan. Purchases of chemicals, glass, tanks, diagrams of altered lungs, webbing, prolonged breath-holding. This was not the mad improvisation of a single night. It was a program. There is a kind of institutional arrogance in programs like these, an assumption that science, or pseudoscience, can speed time and force evolution. They believed they could accelerate nature by act and artifact, by ritualized procedure and surgical precision. When men begin to believe they can rewrite the body on paper and then make the body obey, institutions are born, hidden labs, curated silence, loyal accomplices, structures designed to make the impossible feel inevitable. And here is a principle you must carry forward. Secrecy breeds legitimacy to those within it. When a family surrounds its actions with confidential reports, sworn oaths, and a narrative of destiny, the taboo becomes proof of profundity. The more forbidden the act, the more it convinces members that they are chosen. The outside world sees perversion, the inside sees initiation. That inversion is a psychological weapon. It corrodes moral boundaries from the inside out. The Caetano mansion was not merely a house, it was an apparatus. Its architecture was designed less for comfort and more for containment, ritual, and concealment. The concentric furniture in the main hall, the veiled mirrors, the geometrically patterned meals on untouched plates, these were not eccentricities. They were spatial codes, each arrangement reinforcing a worldview in which geometry was not decoration, but invocation. The house functioned as a stage where everyday life blurred with ceremony, where servants unknowingly maintained symbols they thought were accidents of taste. When authorities finally penetrated the deeper levels of the estate, they uncovered the hidden chamber. It connected to the sea cave below, an artery binding the family directly to the Atlantic. Here the truth was laid bare. Journals filled with anatomical sketches showed limbs distorted into fins, lungs diagrammed into twin systems, eyes widened and refracted like those of deep-sea creatures. Pages tracked generations of the family as if they were experimental animals, bloodlines annotated with cryptic sigils beside names, marriages selected for traits, births treated as clinical results. This was not corruption of chance. It was corruption with intent. The Caetanos believed transformation was inheritance fulfilled. They spoke of an ancestor in Brazil, 1768, who had encountered beings of the sea. That event, whatever it truly was, became origin myth and operating manual. Each generation carried the pact forward, not as story, but as obligation. The journals detailed how partners were chosen not for social alliance or wealth, but for blood compatibility. Even the scandal that drove them from Lisbon was not disgrace in their eyes, but a necessary fracture, a public mask falling away so the true work could continue in isolation. The cove became their true altar, servants who dared to spy D's. Scribed black stone circles underwater, carved with symbols painful to behold. Fish avoided the sight, birds veered away. At its heart stood a platform that defied explanation, warm to the touch though submerged in freezing currents. When divers finally explored it, they reported that the stone pulsed, slow, rhythmic, like breath through a vast lung. Anchored to the platform were three objects: a human-like specimen with alien features, a metallic sphere that shifted colors with the angle of vision, and a book bound in human skin, filled with texts no scholar could translate. These were not curiosities. They were proof of contact, evidence that the Caetanos were not inventing fantasies, but sustaining a tradition tied to entities outside human history. The family's physical changes were noted by locals who dealt with them in their final months. Skin that shimmered as if wet, eyes that bulged with a yellow film, a daughter concealing ridges along her neck. These were not symptoms of illness. They were signs of transition. Purchases of salt, formaldehyde, and chemical solutions revealed preparation not for mere ritual, but for metamorphosis. Tanks of glass ordered from Germany, specialized equipment for maintaining precise salinity, all tools for sustaining hybrid life. What servants glimpsed as perverse family gatherings were in fact rehearsals for a final act, abandoning land and finishing their passage into the sea. The last journal entries leave no ambiguity. The patriarch wrote of progress, his wife and sister breathing water for hours, his youngest son enduring long submersions, the genetic material binding with success. His words declared the time had come for the final phase under the dark moon. He assured the unknown reader that affairs were in order, servants dismissed, and that they would descend to claim their true heritage. The ritual was not described in Dupont or tale, but its outcome was clear. The family left the house intact, walked into the water, and disappeared. Months later, when Mariana's transformed body was caught in a fishing net, the fiction of disappearance collapsed. Her corpse bore both surgical scars and biological adaptations no science could explain: gills along the ribs, webbed extremities, jaw structure reshaped for currents. She had not drowned, she had suffocated in air. The family had succeeded in their metamorphosis, but the surface world had killed her when she was dragged above. From that moment, the authorities acted with urgency. They destroyed the underwater circles with explosives. They sealed archives, sanitized reports, and closed the case as a maritime accident. But evidence survived, in journals smuggled, in divers' testimonies hidden in Lisbon, in Dr. Carvalho's rediscovery decades later. What survived proves the family's descent was deliberate. It was not madness, not superstition. It was the execution of a design laid across centuries, hidden beneath the language of scandal, buried under the machinery of official silence. The mansion rotted. The cove was forbidden, yet even destroyed structures echo. Fishermen continued to hear singing below the waves. Strange figures surfaced near the estate on moonless nights. And the legend persisted, not because villagers loved gossip, but because what they saw confirmed the story officials denied. The Caetanos were not gone, they had crossed, and if the journals were true, they were not the first, and they would not be the last. The silence surrounding the Caetano affair was not accidental. Silence is the most powerful weapon of institutions. It is sharper than a blade, heavier than a stone, more binding than any law. Once Mariana's transformed body was confiscated, Lisbon took control. Reports were redacted, testimonies altered, objects quietly catalogued under classifications that rendered them untouchable. The local officer who first entered the mansion, Sergeant Oliveira, wrote candid letters to his superior confessing his terror at what he had seen: the pulsing stone, the breathing platform beneath the waves. Those letters were never meant for public eyes. They survived only because his private papers were misplaced in an archive box, buried under decades of dust. The official narrative became simple. The Caetano family perished in a maritime incident. Their yacht was missing, their house abandoned, and so the case was closed. This is how institutions strangle truth. By replacing it with a narrative so mundane it demands no further curiosity, but beneath that lie, evidence continued to whisper. Dr. Carvalho's discovery in 2011 reopened the wound. Her doctoral research into colonial families had nothing to do with the occult, yet she stumbled upon reports of anatomical experiments, confiscated specimens, and the words, "family matter of moral concern," stamped over documents like a scar. That euphemism, moral concern, was code, not for immorality, but for something so destabilizing it threatened the structures of power themselves. What unsettled the officials most was not the family's perversions. Human history is littered with the grotesque appetites of elites. What disturbed them was the evidence of success. The journals and the body of Mariana revealed that the Caetanos had crossed into something new, human enough to be recognizable, but altered enough to suggest another stage of being. Lens formation on that scale undermines the story. Civilization tells about itself, that humanity is fixed, bounded, contained within nature as we understand it. If one family could achieve metamorphosis through ritual and design, what else might be possible? What other bloodlines had already attempted it? The destruction of the cove was not about geology, as the government claimed. It was about erasing proof. Divers reported underwater chambers cut into bedrock, air pockets sustained by unknown methods, belongings of the Caetanos preserved within, and embryonic forms suspended in glass tanks. These were not dreams. They were material, undeniable, irreducible. The final journal entry described the family's deliberate passage into the sea. They had dismissed their servants, arranged their affairs, and chosen to leave humanity behind. They saw it not as death, but as ascension into heritage. Heritage, this word recurs throughout their records. They believed they were heirs to a covenant sealed in 1768 off the coast of Brazil, when an ancestor allegedly encountered the beings of the deep. That pact bound the family across generations. Every scandal, every relocation, every ritual, they were all expressions of fidelity to that first encounter. In their minds, they were not deviants but chosen inheritors. To them, Lisbon's laws, the Church's morality, even the authority of empire were trivial compared to the command of that covenant. When investigators destroyed the stone platform with explosives, they assumed the danger was ended, but destruction of form does not erase memory. Local fishermen continued to speak of lights moving beneath the water, of shapes surfacing in silence on dark nights, of voices singing in no human tongue. Their nets tore in strange ways, compasses failed, the island learned to avoid the eastern cliffs, leaving the estate to crumble under mist and rain. Yet legends do not fade when they are fed by sightings. They evolve into collective memory, half denied but never silenced. What makes this case more than a curiosity is its pattern. Wealth, secrecy, ritual, transformation, and institutional suppression. This is not unique to the Caetanos. This is a cycle seen across history. Families who enclose themselves in doctrine, who treat their bloodline as experiment, who construct hidden structures beneath the earth or sea, and who disappear into a silence purchased by power. The difference here is that fragments survived, and those fragments reveal the shape of what was attempted. The breathing stone, the glowing sphere, the preserved specimen, all these suggest contact with something outside the human story. Whether creature, artifact, or something more, the Caetanos believed they were not inventing but restoring. They saw themselves as reclaiming a state humanity had abandoned, and their transformation, partial though it was, suggests they were not entirely wrong. By the time authorities sealed the records, the damage was done. The family was gone, the evidence scattered, the legend sealed into whispers. But every generation of islanders has repeated the same refrain. The Caetanos did not die. They descended. They traded one world for another. And when the sea is blackest, when the tide pulls strongest, when no light penetrates the water, they say you can still hear them calling. Voices of a family who abandoned land for the promise of an older inheritance. By 1934, the Caetano case had already become something more than an investigation. It was a fracture line between what was admitted and what was concealed. When Mariana's body was seized and studied, Lisbon's medical authority, Dr. Miguel Santos, filed a clinical report that reads today like science fiction. He described incomplete metamorphosis between human and an unknown marine form, noting surgical interventions that had accelerated a process which should have taken evolutionary epochs. Most damning was his conclusion. The girl had not drowned but suffocated in air. The water was no longer her enemy. The land was. That report was never meant to see daylight. It was buried, classified, and locked under a regime of silence, yet fragments of it survived in correspondence. Dr. Santos confessed privately that he had nightmares of gill-lined lungs and half-formed faces pressing against glass tanks. He described the specimen's skin as neither fish nor human, but something that reflected light like scales of memory. His words reveal a truth he could not publish. He feared that what he examined was not an anomaly, but the beginning of a species shift. Meanwhile, divers summoned to explore the cove uncovered the chambers carved into the seabed. These were not natural formations. They were engineered dwellings, stone passages, preserved belongings, journals continuing Mateus Caetano's research, and embryonic forms suspended in fluid. To the divers, it was not merely a ruin, but an underwater colony in its infancy. The most chilling artifact was the last journal entry. Dated 2 days before the family's disappearance, it spoke of progress, of successful secondary respiration, of children enduring hours beneath the waves, and of the decision to commit fully to the water. The final words were almost triumphant. "We go willingly to claim our rightful heritage. We are not the first family to make this journey, and we will not be the last. Look to the water. We have always been there, watching." That sentence echoed like a threat disguised as a revelation. If true, it suggested the Caetanos were part of a lineage, one strand among many, each family pledged to a covenant deeper than empire or church. The authorities who read those lines understood the danger, not simply the biological threat of a family transfiguring into something ungovernable, but the psychological threat of belief spreading. If men came to think they could abandon land and cross into the sea as heirs of some ancient pact, the legitimacy of church, crown, and state would erode. Civilization is sustained by boundaries. When those boundaries dissolve, so does control. Thus the cover-up intensified. The underwater chambers were destroyed with explosives, their contents confiscated. The mansion was seized, declared unsafe, and left to rot. The official files were rewritten to describe a maritime accident, their yacht lost in a storm, their bodies never recovered. Publicly, it was a tragedy. Privately, it was an erasure. Yet erasures always leave residue. Fishermen who worked the waters around the eastern cliffs told of shadows moving beneath their boats, of nets torn by unseen hands, of voices rising from the depths in a tongue they could not recognize. In 1958, a team of geologists studying volcanic structures near the cove reported hearing rhythmic vibrations under the water, like the pulse of a massive organ. Their instruments failed without explanation. Their reports, too, were quietly archived. The islanders kept their own record in whispers. They spoke of figures glimpsed in moonless waters, elongated, glistening, surfacing only to sink again with inhuman grace. They described the sea as restless near the estate, as if tides themselves recoiled from what lay below. Or the villagers. The Caetanos had not died. They had gone where they always intended. The estate was only their cocoon. The ocean was their true home. The story grew darker in its implications. If the Caetanos succeeded in their transition, then what became of them in the depths? Did they survive as a new species or dissolve into myth? Were they alone, or did they join others who had taken the same path centuries before? The journals made it clear they believed themselves part of a continuum. The first encounter in Brazil was not a singular event, but a revelation of kinship. Institutions fear nothing more than continuity of forbidden knowledge. A single madman can be dismissed. A family line with centuries of method and covenant cannot. That is why Lisbon obliterated the cove, sealed the files, and reduced the Caetanos to a cautionary tale of aristocratic eccentricity. The real fear was not what the family became, but the possibility that others might follow and succeed. By the mid-20th century, the Caetano name was officially dead, erased from registers, dissolved into bureaucratic nothingness. Yet beneath the silence, fragments of the truth circulated among a small circle of men, naval officers, archivists, and scholars who had seen too much to dismiss. They spoke in code, never publicly, but their correspondence reveals a shared obsession, the conviction that the family had achieved not madness, but transition. One of the more disturbing pieces of evidence was a sealed package discovered in 1972 in Lisbon's maritime archives. Inside were water-damaged pages believed to be from one of the Caetano journals. Though most of the ink had dissolved, several passages remained legible. They described Phase 3, in which the family was to abandon clothing, names, and speech as markers of terrestrial identity. The body itself was to become the only scripture, skin altered, lungs remade, limbs reconfigured. It was a theology of flesh, where ritual and biology fused into a single path. What horrified the archivists was not the strangeness of the words, but their precision. The descriptions matched transformations Mariana's corpse had already displayed. It was not fantasy, it was instruction. That is why the state treated the case as contagion. Ideas of transfiguration, once spoken, are harder to contain than any virus. A body is limited, but an idea, that can infect nations. In the Cold War atmosphere of the 1950s and 60s, when governments were already obsessed with secrecy, control, and the boundaries of human potential, the Caetano incident was studied not as folklore, but as a threat model. Reports suggest that certain agencies quietly analyzed the surviving documents, not to understand them as superstition, but to mine them for possibilities. The grotesque became blueprint. Meanwhile, the island itself absorbed the legend into its bones. Children were warned never to swim near the eastern cliffs. Sailors swore they saw hands, pale and webbed, pressing briefly against the hulls of their boats before slipping away. At night, the water sometimes vibrated with a resonance that locals described as song without melody. These reports never reached newspapers because the people of Ilhaus Corvos knew better than to invite ridicule. But they remembered. Collective memory preserved what official history erased. Dr. Carvalho's rediscovery in 2011 confirmed what villagers had always whispered. The documents had not all been destroyed. Her analysis showed a consistent pattern. Every major discovery about the family was followed by immediate suppression. First, the mansion was abandoned. Then the cove destroyed. Then the records sealed. Each action was not reactive but preemptive. It was as if the state feared not the past, but the possibility of recurrence. For recurrence is the true horror here. The Caetanos claimed they were not the first and would not be the last. Their ancestors' pact in 1768 was framed as continuation, not invention. That implies lineage, multiple families bound to similar covenants across oceans and centuries. If one succeeded in Portugal, who is to say others did not elsewhere? How many names were erased? How many estates burned? How many coves sealed under geological pretexts? The deeper one looks, the clearer the pattern becomes. Forbidden knowledge rises, institutions suppress it, fragments survive, and legends bloom. Over time, the legends are dismissed as superstition, yet when compared, they align too closely to ignore. Tales of coastal families disappearing into the sea, of hybrid forms caught in fishermen's nets, of songs beneath the waves. They stretch from Brazil to the Azores, from Brittany to the Caribbean. The Caetanos are not anomaly but evidence, and this is why their story continues to matter. It is not simply a tale of one family's descent. It is a case study in how truth is managed, not destroyed, but hidden, redacted, buried beneath euphemisms like moral concern or unstable geology. Power always seeks to curate what men may believe about themselves. For if men discovered that the boundaries of the human body could be rewritten, that identity itself could dissolve and reform, control would collapse. The family's fate was therefore never theirs alone. It was a demonstration to those who rule of what must never be allowed to spread. Even destroyed, the Caetanos linger. The mansion stands ruined, the cliffs eroded, but the ocean still guards what remains. Fishermen say that in storms, voices rise with the wind, crying not in pain, but in exultation, as if the family did not perish at all, but thrived beneath the waves, mocking the land that once constrained them. Whether this is folklore or fact no longer matters. The boundary has already been crossed. The truth is simple and terrible. The Caetanos were not victims. They were pioneers of a darker heritage, and though their estate was silenced, their lineage may still breathe in the black water beyond the cliffs. The decades that followed the official erasure only thickened the shadows around the Caetano name. What remained of their estate collapsed into ruin, overgrown by ivy and salt moss, yet the land itself resisted assimilation. No farmer reclaimed the fields, no entrepreneur turned the grounds into a resort, no developer dared cut a road through the eastern cliffs. The place remained in limbo, abandoned yet never forgotten. Locals avoided it with the same instinct that keeps animals from drinking tainted water. And yet, silence never truly holds. In 1986, a group of amateur divers from Porto, unaware of the old prohibitions, descended into the waters near the Caetano Cove. 2 returned. The third was never found. The survivors reported disorientation, as if the sea itself had turned against their instruments, pulling them deeper into channels that had no business existing in local geology. They swore they saw structures, arches, columns, a network like drowned streets, and shadows that swam with purpose. Officials declared the missing diver lost to a current, but the locals muttered the family had claimed him. Such incidents were always managed with the same pattern: swift suppression, banal explanations, paperwork that resolved nothing but left no space for doubt. Each time the story was reduced to accident, storm, or misadventure. But in whispers, the pattern grew undeniable. Something in that water was alive, and it was watching. The suppressed documents recovered by Dr. Carvalho in the 21st century sharpened this suspicion into near certainty. Among them was a memorandum dated 1947, drafted by Naval Intelligence. It described the persistence of anomalous sonar signatures near the destroyed cove, as if something large and mobile occupied the site but evaded classification. The report recommended no further investigation, citing cultural sensitivity in the region. This was bureaucratic camouflage. Sensitivity meant fear. The Navy had seen enough to know not to return. What lingers most unsettlingly in the fragments is the family's conviction that they were not unique. The phrase appears in multiple places: "We are not the first, and we will not be the last." It recurs like liturgy. This claim reframes the entire affair, not as an isolated descent into obsession, but as one node in a hidden web of transformation rituals scattered across coasts and centuries. If the Caetanos succeeded, then who else had crossed into the depths? Whose bloodlines had dissolved quietly into the sea, leaving only whispers behind? There are rumors, never substantiated, always suppressed, of parallel cases. In the Azores, fishermen claimed to haul nets containing malformed creatures that shrieked like children before dissolving in the air. In coastal Brittany, an abandoned chapel was said to contain murals of men with fins kneeling before a sunken throne. In Maranhão, Brazil, families whispered of ancestors who went back to the water after a pact with beings beneath the reefs. Each of these stories could be dismissed alone. Together, they form a continuum too precise to ignore. The Caetanos were simply the case that cracked open. They left evidence too physical to erase, a corpse too changed to deny, journals too meticulous to dismiss as fantasy. Their tragedy, if tragedy it was that they succeeded too publicly. They crossed the threshold, but left the door ajar. Authorities scrambled to seal it, but in doing so, they confirmed it had existed. And here lies the deeper horror. Institutions suppress, not because they disbelieve, but because they know. Their silence is not skepticism, it is complicity. By burying the Caetanos under euphemism and redaction, they acknowledged the transformation was real and dangerous and repeatable. They did not fear or a single family in Portugal. They feared contagion of belief that others might attempt the same and succeed. Today, the ruins of the mansion still stand, battered by storms, windows hollow as eye sockets. Tourists sometimes wander close, snapping photographs of the haunted estate, never realizing the weight of history beneath their feet. At night, locals still hear strange cries from the cliffs, sometimes mistaken for seals, sometimes for children, and always the same warning circulates: do not swim east of the cove on a moonless night. The Caetanos may be gone from the land, but the sea keeps what is given to it, and if the journals are true, the family has not vanished at all. They endure in the deep, waiting, watching, patient as tides. The boundary was crossed once, it can be crossed again, and perhaps it already has. By the early 2000s, the Caetano affair had retreated into the comfortable obscurity of local legend. Tour guides mentioned the mansion only in passing, weaving it into a tapestry of island superstitions, witches, shipwrecks, ghostly monks. But those who truly studied the documents knew better. Legends distort, but they do not spring from nothing. The fragments preserved by archivists like Dr. Carvalho revealed a continuity too sharp to dismiss. The final phase of the family's project there, Ascent through Descent, was never simply about biology. The writings describe transformation as a covenant, a bond between flesh and environment, oath and inheritance. In their words, the ocean was not foreign but ancestral. Humanity, they claimed, had abandoned its truer form when it left the waters, and only a few chosen lineages remembered the way back. The Caetanos did not believe they were inventing monstrosities. They believed they were reclaiming what was lost. That belief has consequences. Once articulated, it becomes a seed in the mind. Even decades after the family's disappearance, whispers circulated of others, researchers, cultists, even biologists, who revisited the idea. A 1993 police report from Setúbal describes a group arrested for attempting submersion rites off the coast. The participants carried diagrams strikingly similar to Caetano sketches. When questioned, they spoke of blood renewal and the covenant of water. The incident was never covered by press. But in the margins of the report, one officer scrawled a note: "They knew too much." Meanwhile, the ocean itself seemed unwilling to relinquish the memory. Naval patrols recorded sonar anomalies, shapes too large for known fish, moving in patterns inconsistent with submarines or whales. They appeared most often near the ruins of the Caetano Cove, then vanished as suddenly as they came. On more than one occasion, divers reported hearing choral vibrations beneath the waves, sounds structured like music but carried through water, impossible to trace. When compared to Mariana's autopsy notes, which mentioned resonance chambers in her altered lungs, the implication was chilling. The Caetanos may have carried with them not just their bodies, but their voices. The institutions that managed the affair responded with their old weapon: silence. Reports were shelved, witnesses discredited, ruins left unmarked. But silence is never neutral. It is the residue of fear. If nothing had been real, there would have been no need to hide it. The very persistence of suppression is proof that the family's legacy endured. And what of the family themselves? If they succeeded in completing their metamorphosis, their fate is unimaginable. The deep sea is vast, largely uncharted, inhospitable to human life, but perhaps not to something adjacent. To live there would be to exist outside history, unseen yet present, observing the land from which they severed themselves. For the Caetanos, that was not exile but triumph. They had inverted the logic of empire, abandoning the land to colonize the abyss. Legends among the islanders confirm this inversion. They speak of nights when storms drive strange figures against the rocks, bodies slick with scales, eyes reflecting lantern light. Some are said to survive long enough to crawl back into the surf. Others are found lifeless, their flesh already dissolving, as if the air itself rejected them. The villagers bury such remains without speaking, for they know the truth cannot be admitted without consequence. The great irony is that the Caetanos were destroyed not because they failed, but because they succeeded too visibly. A single corpse in a fisherman's net was enough to shatter the illusion of human fixity. If more had surfaced, the story of Manki and itself would have cracked. The family became a cautionary tale not against hubris but against revelation. In 1958, a team of government geologists arrived on Ilhaus Corvos, tasked with studying the volcanic formations that shaped the island. Their survey was meant to be routine, a scientific expedition detached from the folklore that still clung to the place. Yet when they turned their instruments toward the eastern peninsula, the forbidden cove once owned by the Caetanos, their readings broke the pattern. The rock beneath the seabed emitted strange vibrations, rhythmic pulses inconsistent with geological activity. One technician, unsure how else to describe it, wrote in his notes, "The stone is beating like a heart." What unnerved them most was not the readings, but the divers' testimony. The team had been instructed to remain on the surface, but 3 divers descended against orders to confirm what the instruments suggested. They returned pale and trembling, refusing to enter the water again. When pressed, one finally muttered a fragmented account. There were chambers, lit from within, as if the rocks themselves glowed. Something moved between them, not fish, not human. He refused to elaborate further. Within weeks, the entire team was reassigned. Their findings were classified and sealed. But scraps survived in private journals, later unearthed by independent researchers. These described not simply natural anomalies but structures, stone corridors that seemed carved rather than formed, archways too regular to be volcanic. Some passages led deeper, into voids the divers could not chart. And always the sound, a low, continuous resonance, like the vibration of a distant organ, reverberating through their bones, even when their ears registered nothing. If this was true, then the destruction ordered in 1935, the explosives meant to collapse the cove, had not obliterated the Caetano legacy. It had merely buried it deeper, sealing something alive into chambers below the sea bed. The family's final journals had spoken of joining ancestors, of continuing the covenant. Perhaps they had not lied. Perhaps their ritual had truly opened a path downward, into the hidden arteries of the earth where water and stone intermingle. The implications are staggering. If a family could alter their physiology enough to survive below, then the disappearance of their bodies is no longer a mystery. They did not vanish. They migrated. Evolution, accelerated by obsession and ritual, completed beneath the waves. What the geologists glimpsed may have been the remnants of that migration, their sanctuary carved into the volcanic bedrock, their domain insulated from air and time. For the islanders, such reports were unnecessary. They already knew. They had heard the voices carried on fog-drenched nights, mournful songs in an alien tongue. They had seen the slick trails on the rocks after storms, as though something had crawled ashore and then slipped back to sea. And they had inherited the old warnings: do not fish near the cove, do not swim on moonless nights, do not follow the singing no matter how beautiful it sounds. The state dismissed all this as superstition, yet, paradoxically, it reinforced those same taboos. The cove remained officially restricted, the ruins left to rot, the subject erased from textbooks and local history. This was not disbelief, it was containment, a silent acknowledgement that some truths cannot be dissolved, only suppressed. And in that suppression lies the deepest corruption of all. The institutions meant to preserve truth instead guard its absence. They would rather erase human history than admit humanity is not alone in its form, nor sovereign in its domain. The Caetanos forced open a door no one wanted opened, and because of that their name became a curse, their story a whisper. By the 1970s, the Caetano affair was spoken of only in fragmented warnings, never directly, always with avoidance in the eyes of those who remembered. But silence cannot fully erase what lingers beneath the surface. It leaves traces like scars under the skin, and every so often something surfaces that reminds the living of what was buried. Fishermen from Corvos began reporting nets dragged down with a force no whale or current could explain. When hauled up, many nets were torn as if slashed by blades. Others came up heavy with salt-crusted stones, arranged unnaturally in small circles, as though someone had placed them carefully at the seabed. The authorities called it coincidence, dismissed it as seafloor debris. But the fishermen knew better. They had inherited a pattern of fear passed down from their fathers and grandfathers. Stay away from the Caetano waters, for nothing caught there comes without cost. One storm season in 1974, a body washed ashore. At first, it was mistaken for a drowned sailor, until the coroner examined it. The chest was oddly expanded, the ribs bent outward in a way impossible for natural growth. Along the sides of the neck were faint ridges, as though something once lay beneath the skin and had since collapsed. The hands were elongated, the nails thickened and curved. Officially, the report was sealed as an unidentified drowning victim. But the islanders whispered another name, Mariana. The implication was unbearable. If this was truly the Caetano daughter, then she had survived decades in the sea before finally succumbing to the air. But perhaps she had not been alone. Perhaps others still lived below, sustained by the hidden chambers described by the geologists years earlier. The thought spread quietly through the villages like a virus. They are still there. They never left. At the same time, fragments of Caetano documents began leaking into academic circles. Most were dismissed as frauds or literary hoaxes, yet their consistency was unsettling. They spoke of rituals requiring salt in vast quantities, of songs sung underwater to resonate with the bones of the earth, of transformation as both sacrifice and inheritance. These were not the delusions of a single mind, but a body of work carried through generations, bound by obsession. In 1979, a Portuguese naval officer stationed in the Azores wrote an anonymous letter to a Lisbon newspaper that was never published but preserved in the archives. He described a sonar anomaly off Corvos, a moving mass, almost architectural in shape, that shifted against the current. It was not submarine, not whale, not school of fish, he wrote. It was a structure that seemed to breathe. His superiors ordered silence. Within weeks, the officer was transferred and his name disappeared from the rolls. This pattern repeats across history. Every sighting, every scrap of evidence is quickly smothered, hidden, reclassified. Institutions do not waste energy silencing what is false. They silence what threatens. And the Caetano story threatens not only history, but the foundation of human self-conception. For if a single family could rewrite their bodies and vanish into the deep, what does that say about the boundaries we cling to? What does it reveal about the fragility of humanity itself? The ocean has always been a mirror. It reflects back not only the sky, but our fears, our myths, our suppressed truths. The Caetanos did not merely disappear into it, they became part of it. And sometimes when the sea turns black and the waves crash without rhythm, you feel the weight of that inheritance pressing against the shore. The deeper one digs into the Caetano affair, the more it ceases to resemble a simple story of madness or family scandal. What emerges instead is a blueprint, an intentional map left behind by those who believed they had transcended the human condition. Their journals, their architecture, their experiments, even their disappearance all point to a single truth. The Caetanos did not act blindly. They acted with knowledge, or at least with a conviction that knowledge was guiding them. The earliest records trace their lineage back to the late 18th century, when the patriarch's great-grandfather is said to have encountered them off the coast of Brazil in 1768. Who were they? The wording is deliberately vague, yet consistent across multiple texts, the ones below, the ones before, the ones who wait. Whether this referred to a secret order, a hidden colony, or something more unearthly is impossible to say. But it suggests that the Caetanos did not invent their practices in isolation. They inherited them. They were inducted. If true, then the island of Corvos was not merely an accident of geography but a chosen site, a place aligned with something older. The underwater circles, the carved stones that strained the eyes, the warm breathing platform. These were not random constructions. They were continuations, expansions of a covenant already in motion. The Caetanos were not pioneers but apprentices in a tradition that predated them, a tradition that demanded secrecy, transformation, and ultimately, sacrifice. The most chilling part of their preserved notes lies not in the grotesque details of their rituals, but in the cold rationality with which they described them. They documented body measurements, chemical compositions, genealogical charts, salinity adjustments. They recorded the reactions of their children to treatments that no sane parent would inflict. It reads less like an madness than method, less like fantasy than protocol. If this was delusion, it was delusion with the discipline of science, and here lies the unsettling intersection between myth and modernity. The Caetanos operated in the margins of empire, but their methods anticipated biogenetics, bioengineering, controlled environments. They were not medieval mystics muttering incantations. They were early experimenters in forced evolution. They blurred the line between laboratory and altar, and in that blurring they created something institutions could neither classify nor tolerate. The suppression of their story, then, is not just about morality or scandal. It is about control. If humanity can be rewritten, if form itself is fluid, then all the rigid hierarchies of state, church, and science tremble. Power depends on stability, on the belief that man is fixed, defined, contained. The Caetanos cracked that belief open. That is why their mansion was bombed, why their archives were hidden, why their name survives only as whisper. But whispers endure, and every fragment that resurfaces, every net torn, every sonar anomaly, every half-decayed body washed ashore, keeps the wound open. It reminds us that what was done once can be done again. Perhaps it is being done again in labs and coves far from the public eye. The techniques described in their journals, crude as they were, foreshadowed modern capabilities. What would those same rituals look like if married to today's genetic technologies? What would stop another family, another order from attempting the final phase again? The Caetanos vanished into the sea nearly a century ago, yet in truth they never vanished at all. They became a possibility, a prototype of something beyond us but not entirely separate from us, and that possibility remains, silent, submerged, waiting for the moment the world above fractures enough to make the return inevitable. Because the lesson of the Caetanos is not that they were destroyed, it is that they succeeded. By the mid-1980s, Portugal's government had little interest in reopening the Caetano file. The regime had shifted, the world was modernizing, and official narratives of progress left no room for sea-born dynasties. Yet beneath the polished veneer of politics, fragments continued to emerge, carried like driftwood into the hands of those who dared to look. One such fragment appeared in 1986 when a diver working with a private salvage company recovered a sealed jar from the seabed near Corvos. Inside was a water-damaged notebook written in archaic Portuguese. Its pages were warped, but legible passages described the covenant of salt and the promise of the abyss. It spoke of those who sing beneath the waves, whose blood we share and whose form we shall inherit. The handwriting matched that of Matthias Caetano himself. The find was quietly purchased by an unnamed collector, vanishing again into private vaults. The same year, NATO naval exercises in the Atlantic logged an unidentified sonar contact in the same sector. The object moved with deliberate speed, slowing, then accelerating against currents. Its size was estimated at over 30 meters, too large for any known submarine at the time. The data was classified, never meant for civilian eyes. But a single technician leaked a copy of the record, and in the margin, a note in pencil: "Movement is organic." For those who have studied the case, the pattern is undeniable. Evidence resurfaces only to be buried again. Stories are told only to be silenced. Yet the repetition itself is revealing. Power does not waste resources burying fantasies. Suppression is the truest sign of reality, and reality, in this case, is far darker than the sanitized history taught in classrooms. The villagers of Corvos never needed naval records to believe. They lived with the signs, the absence of gulls over the cove, the strange hum that vibrated through the cliffs on windless nights. The way fish, when caught near those waters, sometimes bore deformities: gills too large, eyes set too far apart, spines twisted as though reshaped. They buried these catches without eating them, treating them as offerings returned to the sea. Such rituals were not superstition, but survival, an unspoken pact between those who remained on land and those who had gone below. And yet the most haunting detail lies not in what was found, but in what was anticipated. The Caetano journals spoke of phases, each generation more adapted, more fluid, less bound by terrestrial limits. If Mariana's body represented an incomplete transformation, then what of her siblings, her parents, her descendants in the deep? What form might they have achieved after decades beneath the water, refining their metamorphosis in the hidden chambers carved into volcanic stone? Here the line between folklore and forbidden science blurs again, for if their covenant was with something older than themselves, something already present in the deep, then their evolution was not innovation, but reunion. They did not become monsters, they became kin. Kin to what, we cannot name, but the implication is there in every report of singing from beneath the waves, in every sonar anomaly that moves against logic, in every fisherman's whisper of shapes surfacing in storms. The tragedy, if one dares call it that, is not their disappearance. It is our ignorance. The Caetanos glimpsed a truth about humanity that we are forbidden to admit, that we are not finished, that our form is not destiny, that something older than us waits to claim us as its own. And once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. What the government sealed, what the church denounced, what the islanders whisper, together they form a single message. The Caetanos are not gone, they are submerged, and the SE does not forget its children. The final letters exchanged between Sergeant Oliveira and his mainland superior reveal what may be the most disturbing dimension of the Caetano case. Until those letters surfaced in Dr. Carvalho's research, most assumed the family's disappearance was explained, either by madness, by cultic delusion, or by some grotesque accident of biology. But Oliveira's private correspondence hints at something far darker, complicity at the highest levels. In one letter, dated August 1933, just weeks after the family's estate was found abandoned, Oliveira confides, "I have been instructed to halt further inquiries. The orders do not come from Lisbon alone, but from higher, beyond even the governor. They insist the matter is closed, though we have not yet located the missing bodies, nor accounted for the documents. They speak of property management, but their urgency is not of land, it is of blood." In a second, more desperate letter, Oliveira admits his own fear. "I no longer believe this was an isolated incident. Too many signs point to a network. The supplies they ordered, the correspondences with foreign addresses, the symbols found on the stones, none of this belongs to a single family. It belongs to a fraternity, one that survives in silence." Here lies the implication authorities most feared. The Caetanos were not aberrations, but initiates of something older, broader, and still alive. If true, then their island estate was not simply the seat of madness, but a node in a larger web, a colony perhaps, of a hidden order tracing its lineage back centuries, even millennia. The destruction of their cove may not have been meant to erase them, but to seal what remained below. The pattern of erasure since then reinforces this suspicion. Every document that surfaces disappears into private collections. Every anomaly at sea is classified. Every witness is silenced or discredited. The cons, extensive of suppression across decades and regimes, suggests not bureaucratic coincidence, but a continuing hand, a structure with vested interest in keeping the story buried. Yet the ocean itself betrays the lie. In 1991, a deep-sea trawler operating illegally off Corvos hauled in what the crew at first believed was a mutilated dolphin. Closer inspection revealed otherwise. The torso bore unmistakably human proportions, yet the skull was elongated, the jaw extended with rows of sharpened teeth. The crew panicked, threw the body back into the sea, and abandoned their catch. Days later, 2 of the men vanished at sea. The survivors never spoke publicly, but one told a priest before fleeing the island, "It came back for us." Whether this is truth or superstition, it follows the same trajectory: suppression, silence, disappearance. The Caetanos do not remain in the past. They surface again and again in fragments too consistent to ignore. Perhaps the greatest horror of the Caetano affair is not that one family sought to rewrite humanity, but that they may have succeeded and others may have followed. If Oliveira's suspicion was correct, then the island was only one site among many, a test, an outpost, a ritual center. If that is true, then the covenant of the sea was never confined to Corvos. It spread, hidden in networks of wealth and bloodline, waiting for its moment to surface again. History will not admit this possibility. Institutions cannot allow it. But the silence itself is evidence enough. The Caetanos did not act alone, and if they were not alone, then they are not extinct. They are legion, scattered, waiting beneath tides and in hidden archives, their inheritance sealed not by failure, but by patience. And patience is the weapon of the sea. It does not hurry. It waits, erodes, reshapes, and one day it takes back everything. By the early 2000s, the Caetano affair had slipped almost entirely into myth. To the outside world, it was little more than a local ghost story, repeated in whispers to frighten children or to deter divers from straying too close to forbidden waters. Yet in certain academic and intelligence circles, the story remained very much alive, circulated in redacted reports, quietly debated at closed conferences, annotated in the margins of classified dossiers. One such dossier, leaked briefly in 2004 before being erased from public record, concerned a series of unexplained sonar events in the mid-Atlantic. These were not the usual blips dismissed as whales or geological interference. The signatures were complex, layered, almost linguistic in structure. Analysts compared them to songs, low, resonant pulses that repeated with mathematical precision, as if carrying coded information. The classified conclusion was stark. Unidentified biological intelligence, consistent with but not limited to hypotheses regarding the Caetano descent. The language is clinical, but the implications are extraordinary. If the Caetanos succeeded in their transformation, if their descendants still move beneath the waves, then their communication is not random but deliberate. Language evolved for the medium of water, carried on pressure and vibration. The songs heard by islanders may not have been mournful laments as folklore claimed, but structured dialogue. An oceanic tongue incomprehensible to human ears, yet coherent to those who had become something other. What unsettled investigators most, however, was the scale. The recording suggested not a handful of speakers, but hundreds. The voices rose and fell in overlapping waves, too numerous to attribute to the remnants of a single family line. Either the Caetanos had multiplied in the deep, or they had joined something already vast. Meanwhile, face signs persisted. In 2007, tourists reported seeing figures on the cliffs of Corvos at dusk, tall, pale shapes that slipped into the water when approached. Photographs taken from a distance show only blurs, but the distortions in the images mirror those found in earlier attempts to capture the carved stones of the cove, as if whatever lingers there resists being fixed in human vision, bending light itself into uncertainty. Locals have adapted in the only way they know, by silence. They fish farther from shore, they bar their doors on moonless nights, and they tell the story only obliquely, as if speaking too directly might draw attention from below. Outsiders dismiss this as island superstition, but superstition is often just memory disguised as caution. And so the paradox grows sharper. Officially, the Caetanos never existed as more than a family of eccentrics who vanished in disgrace. Unofficially, their shadow stretches across oceans into naval records, sonar anomalies, bodies half seen, voices half heard. The divide between the two is not ignorance, but intent. Institutions cannot acknowledge them without admitting humanity's boundaries are porous, fragile, already breached. The deeper one follows the trail, the more the conclusion seems inescapable. The Caetanos are not a closed chapter. They are an opening, an aperture through which something older than history seeps into our world, and if the sonar songs are any indication, that aperture is no longer small. It is widening. The sea has always concealed more than it revealed, but concealment is not erasure. It is preparation, and what the Caetanos began, the ocean seems intent on finishing. In 2011, a research vessel from Norway conducting climate studies off the Azores encountered something that has since circulated only in whispers. While lowering deep water sensors, the crew recorded vibrations that did not match any known geological process. The rhythm was unmistakable, repeating intervals, almost musical. At 2,300 meters, the sensors failed entirely, fried by a surge of electromagnetic interference. When the equipment was recovered, the metal casings bore faint etchings, concentric patterns, not unlike those found on the stones of the Caetano estate decades earlier. The crew swore the marks had not been present before deployment. This was not an isolated incident. That same year, 2 divers exploring near Corvos's restricted cove disappeared without trace. Their bodies were never recovered, but their dive logs, transmitted wirelessly before contact was lost, contained distorted audio files. Amid the static, a faint chorus emerges, overlapping voices in tones too low for human throats. Linguists who later examined the files noted repetition and structure, the hallmarks of language. The recordings were confiscated within weeks by state authorities, but not before fragments were copied and spread across obscure academic networks. Patterns emerge when these incidents are placed beside earlier ones. The Caetano songs, once described as folklore, now match sonar anomalies charted across the Atlantic. The breathing structures, reported by geologists in the 1950s, echo the electromagnetic pulses that ruin modern instruments. And the half-seen shapes, once dismissed as tricks of light, return in blurred photographs taken by tourists, always near the cove, always at twilight. If the Caetanos joined something older, then it has been waiting, not in myth, but in patience. What was once dismissed as family delusion now resembles migration, adaptation, multiplication. Their covenant was never abandonment of humanity, but accession to a deeper order, and that order has begun to surface again. By 2015, marine archaeologists mapping submerged volcanic ridges near the Azores stumbled upon what appeared to be cut stone blocks arranged in geometric formations. At first, the team thought they had found remnants of an ancient civilization drowned by rising seas, perhaps a long-forgotten outpost of early Iberian settlers. But closer inspection revealed carvings too precise, too alien to be the work of simple stonemasons. The designs echoed those catalogued in the forbidden Caetano journals, spirals coiled within spirals, shapes that seemed to shimmer differently when viewed from shifting angles. Some divers reported nausea, disorientation, even fleeting hallucinations after prolonged exposure. The Portuguese government quickly intervened. What began as a celebrated archaeological discovery was abruptly reclassified as a geological curiosity, and funding was withdrawn. But the divers' testimonies leaked into online forums, where whispers began again. The Caetano covenant was not confined to their cove. Their ritual, their transformation, their descent into the sea was not an isolated event, but part of a larger network. Structures beneath the Atlantic like waypoints, all linked by the same disturbing geometry. Locals on Corvo still speak of shapes gliding beneath their fishing boats on moonless nights, nets torn open from below, lights beneath the waves like lanterns carried by unseen hands. One fisherman swore he saw a face break the surface, pale, with eyes too large for its skull, ridges along its throat pulsing like gills before it slipped silently back into the black water. His account was dismissed as drunken invention, yet his catch spoiled overnight in a way no one could explain, flesh turning slick and rubbery as though touched by something corrosive. The question no one in authority dares voice is simple. If the Caetanos were only the beginning, how many others followed? And how many are waiting below, unseen, reshaping themselves in silence? In 2018, seismic monitoring stations across the mid-Atlantic detected a series of deep tremors, unlike ordinary tectonic shifts. The patterns were too regular, pulsing every 37 minutes for 3 days straight. Oceanographers suggested it might be a previously unknown volcanic vent, but those who reviewed the data privately noticed something chilling. The tremors formed a sequence, almost like coded intervals, as though the ocean itself was transmitting a message. Shortly after, French naval sonar picked up massive moving anomalies near the same coordinates. At first they were logged as submarines, but no known fleet matched their size or maneuverability. The largest echo measured longer than an aircraft carrier, but the object moved with the fluidity of a living thing. Then it vanished, descending beyond the sonar's reach. Not long after, strange biological material began washing ashore on Corvos and neighboring islands. Fishermen discovered strands of translucent tissue stretching meters in length, still pulsating faintly as though alive. Samples sent for testing produced inconclusive results. The tissue shared some markers with marine invertebrates, but also fragments of human DNA. The report was suppressed, stamped as anomalous contamination. That same summer, tourists visiting the abandoned Caetano estate reported hearing voices drifting up from the sealed cove. Some claimed the voices spoke Portuguese, others swore it was a tongue unlike anything they had ever heard. Recordings made on mobile phones captured only static, yet several devices later showed corrupted files, their storage inexplicably filled with looping symbols that mirrored the patterns etched into the Caetano stones. By 2019, whispers of the Caetano mystery reached circles far beyond historians and islanders. A private research foundation, funded by anonymous patrons and operating under the guise of marine biology, quietly began expeditions into the restricted waters. Divers employed by the foundation spoke later, under anonymity, of finding glass-like structures deep within caverns beneath Corvos. These were not natural formations, they were chambers, their walls smooth and reflective, as if grown rather than built. Within them floated shapes suspended in brine, not quite human, not quite fish, eyes opening slowly when the divers' lights touched them. The team brought back fragments, slivers of bone, strands of hair hardened into a keratin-like shell, and tablets etched with the same indecipherable script first found in the Caetano journals. Geneticists who examined the samples confirmed again what earlier whispers had claimed. The material contained human sequences fused with something unclassified, but when their findings reached peer review, the papers vanished, withdrawn within hours. The researchers who pushed further were silenced. Resignations, suicides, disappearances. Meanwhile, on Corvos, the locals spoke more openly. Fishermen avoided the eastern cliffs entirely, saying the waters boiled when storms approached. Shepherds reported hearing hymns carried on the wind, hymns that rose not from land but from the sea itself, and children dared each other to approach the rusting gates of the Caetano estate, claiming that if you pressed your ear to the stone walls, you could hear faint dripping, as though the house itself still connected to the ocean below. The myth had metastasized into a living dread. What began as one family's secret corruption now stood revealed as something wider. An inheritance older than colonial scandals, older than Portugal itself. The Caetanos were not Sican, creators of this descent, only inheritors. And their choice to embrace it might not have been madness at all, but obedience to a calling that predates history. In 2021, satellite imagery taken during routine ocean surveys revealed something unnerving near the island's restricted cove. Analysts noticed faint circular discolorations beneath the surface, too symmetrical to be reefs, too vast to be wreckage. The formations aligned perfectly with the old seismic records from 2018, as though the tremors had been marking a boundary. When the images leaked onto obscure forums, some claimed they saw movement in later frames, shadows shifting inside the circles like a gathering. At the same time, reports emerged of missing vessels along the mid-Atlantic trade routes. Small yachts, fishing trawlers, even a cargo ship, all vanished without sending distress signals. Insurance companies hushed the cases, governments issued bland explanations, but survivors told a different story. A lifeboat recovered near the Azores carried 3 men who had abandoned their ship. Half mad from thirst, they described luminous shapes rising from the depths, surrounding their vessel in silence. One of the men swore he heard a voice in his head, whispering his name before he leapt overboard. The Vatican too resurfaced in the shadows of this mystery. Confidential correspondence uncovered by investigative journalists showed the church had records on the Caetano family dating back to the 1700s, warnings of maritime heresies and covenants sealed beneath the waves. One document, stamped in 1824, described entire coastal villages in Brazil abandoning their faith after contact with the children of the deep. The Caetanos, it seems, were only one branch of a much wider infection. By now, the pattern was undeniable. The breathing stones, the underwater chambers, the human-sea hybrids. It was all pointing to a system, a structure hidden in the Atlantic for centuries. And if the Caetanos had joined it willingly, their disappearance was not a vanishing at all, but a migration. The kind of migration that prepares for return. By 2023, the mystery could no longer be dismissed as folklore. Naval sonar across multiple nations recorded synchronized pulses stretching from the Azores to the Caribbean, low, resonant vibrations that repeated with mechanical precision. Some described the sound as a beacon, others as a summoning. When the data was analyzed, the pulses formed a pattern resembling the Caetano spirals, a geometry that spoke without words, broadcasting across the deep. That same year, coastal communities in Portugal and Brazil reported an escalation of strange events. Schools of fish beached themselves in grotesque numbers. Whales surfaced near harbors with deep lacerations along their bodies, wounds resembling ritual markings more than injuries from predators. And in Corvos, the island where it all began, locals whispered of new figures seen swimming beneath the moonless waves, taller than any man, moving with deliberate grace, surfacing only long enough for their wide, reflective eyes to catch the starlight. Governments, of course, issued no statement, but confidential leaks hinted at joint Atlantic operations designed not for exploration, but for containment. Mines were laid along certain ridges, sonar arrays blasted disruptive frequencies into the depths, and yet fishermen continued to hear the hymns, louder now, carried not only through water, but vibrating in their bones. The truth buried in archives, censored by churches, erased by bureaucrats, can no longer be ignored. The Caetanos were not an aberration, but the first public crack in a wall that has been crumbling for centuries. Their covenant was not an isolated corruption, but allegiance to a hidden order that has never stopped shaping its children in the dark. What remains is not the question of whether they survived. They did. The question now is simpler and far more disturbing. When the sea calls again, how many will follow them willingly into the water?